Members, if you would turn over to file item number 8, the proposed final draft Delta Plan agenda item. For those of you in the audience who do intend to speak, if you can pick up a blue sheet on any of these items and fill them out and give them to Angela at the end of the podium, we would appreciate that. We're going to start off with staff presentation and summaries with council questions, observations, queries, and so on. Then I'll open it for public comment. Joe, do you want to kick this off, or are you going to defer to?
I'm going to defer to Mr. Ray.
Mr. Ray, tell us where we are, what the documents are in front of us, and so on and so forth.
Well, you have in front of you a staff report and two accompanying versions of the proposed final draft Delta Plan. One is a red line version that depicts the changes that we've made at your direction since we prepared the final staff draft. The other is a clean copy of that. And I thought by way of introduction it might be useful just to review how we got from where we were to where we are. And if you think last fall when you released the final staff draft of the Delta Plan and its EIR, and kicked off the comment period on those documents, we've gone through a huge public involvement exercise. You've held over 16 days of hearings on the Delta Plan. This includes 5 EIR field hearings, and then there's uncounted side meetings and stakeholder briefings and other outreach with individuals. And we've received well in excess of 150 comment letters on the plan. Starting in January, you held 5 hearings that led to the release of the 6th staff draft in January. Remember, John Curlin and Bob Twiss came and shared observations about the comments that had been submitted by various stakeholders. In February, we held 2 days of hearings on the Delta Protection Commission's proposal to protect the Delta as a place that they had submitted to you earlier that month. And that provided much of the material that's now in Chapter 5 and material for other chapters, and 2/3 of their proposals made their way into the plan's policies and recommendations. In March, you held 2 days of hearings to review stakeholder comments, and in April you continued your review and provided direction to us that led to the release in the middle of May of the final staff draft. And you held 5 days of hearings in that, in which you marked it up in 2 days of hearings in June, kicking off with a stakeholder panel that reacted to our final draft, and then 3 days of markup hearings in June and July. And that led to the direction that we hope we have incorporated adequately in the draft before you today. You want to talk about how we got here through the draft then?
Sure, I'll pick up there. So like Dan was saying, that led us to a series of meetings in both June and July where, at your direction, we brought before you a consent list that had approximately 330-odd items that were minor items, and they were brought to you based on public comment letters and also staff changes that they were suggesting to the May 14th draft. In addition to that, there were action item lists. I believe there were 2 of them, and they had approximately 14 items, and those were at the policy and recommendation level. Each of those items got a vote from the council with specific direction to the staff, and as well, you also voted on the consent list, the 300-some items, as direction to staff to make changes to the May 14th version.
And it was 12 or 14 items from the consent list were moved over for independent consideration, is my
Correct.
recollection.
And then those were voted on ultimately, I think, at the July 12th meeting.
Right.
The goal then was to prepare a proposed final draft based on the council direction and to bring that back to a subcommittee of the chair and vice chair for their review to determine whether or not the changes had been made consistently with the council's direction. And you will find a letter in your meeting packet to that end. I don't know if Chair Eisenberg or Vice Chair Fiorini wants to speak to that.
You recall that in the motion that we adopted about process and this plan, you included a reference that Randy and I would review the changes that the staff was proposing to make, to at least opine for ourselves as to whether we thought they were consistent with the actions of the council, which we did in both in advance reading the material, but also in a meeting with staff of some length. And Randy and I then signed the memo dated September 5 that you see in front of you. Just one notation. At the time we did our review, there was still some update work being done on maps, and Dan and everyone else will explain those maps, so we didn't have a chance to do those. But we have had a chance to review them since. From speaking for myself, I think they are now consistent with the council direction, and accordingly, that, our recommendation would be, unless there's something that we missed, that you would also conclude that they are consistent with the council action previously taken. So, Randy.
I want to echo those comments. We had two charges before us when we met a couple of weeks ago to review the staff changes. Those included specific language changes adopted by and recommended by the council to staff, as well as some issues that the staff was given discretion to sort out. So we reviewed the document looking for both of the additions in those areas, and with very, very minor changes, found that staff had done a superb job in incorporating everything, I believe, that the council had directed them to do. I'm very pleased with the outcome and the draft that's before us.
Thank you.
Me too. Okay.
Even your eagle-eyed chair and vice chair
Missed
a couple things that we had missed as well, and they've also pointed out the
That was on purpose, wasn't it?
revisions to the maps. And so we have summarized a few errata and then the changes that
on the
these
errata,
maps depict.
Are copies of this memo out on the table outside? Okay, so
That are
anyone who's interested in the errata stuff, there's a 3-page, I think it's a 3 or 4-page memo out there for you to pick up.
And most of these are simple typos and grammatical errors, but I did want to just call several of them to your attention and make sure there's no question about them.
Okay, members, this is proposed final draft Delta Plan - errata document that Dan's referring to, passed out this morning.
One is an error we made in transcribing the actions on policy ERP3 on page 170. And we inadvertently dropped the word significant, which the council had wanted added as the opening word in that policy, so that it would now say that significant impacts to the opportunities to restore habitat at the elevation shown in figure 4.3 must be avoided or mitigated. And of course, that was a suggestion that Vice Chairman Fiorini had made and that the council directed us to make. In Chapter 5, in policy DPP1, our ever-attentive legal team has proposed a technical rewording of that policy. It does not change the intent or outcome of the policy, but they're confident that makes it clearer and more consistent with the way they would hope to draft the regulations. I did also, too, then want to go through the additional maps and the revisions to maps that we proposed. And these are all derived, really, from the language of that policy, DPP1, or are, we hope, helpful in implementing it. And a key element of that policy is that new development must be located if it's within areas that city or county general plans designate for development, in cities or in their spheres of influence. And when we received the maps back from the consultant team, we realized that the maps, while they carefully depicted the county land use plans in spheres of influences and in cities, they actually didn't have detail from the city land use plans for those areas. In addition, they still had artifacts of some of the earlier map keys that we'd used in describing Bethel Island before you straightened out the policy governing development there. So The map changes for Bethel Island. We removed a pink outline that had depicted that island as being a legacy community. That no longer, that's not because it's not still being thought of as a legacy community, it's because we don't use that term legacy community in the policy that Figure 5.1 refers to. In a small change in the map that affects West Sacramento, identifies two areas that the city of West Sacramento in its general plan has proposed for continued agricultural use, not for development.
That's in the city's own plan.
Yeah, that's in the city's own general plan. And those are areas that are within the Yolo bypass, including areas that are even west of the tow drain. So they're clearly not areas that would ever be contemplated as suitable for urban development, as well as an area that's south of Stonegate that is still planned for agriculture by the city. In Sacramento, the maps have been revised to show areas that the city of Sacramento's general plan proposes for open space and a natural preserve near Freeport within the city's sphere of influence. At Stockton, there's an area on the north side of the city that's within the city's sphere of influence that has been planned for development. The underlying plan that San Joaquin County has for that area was agriculture, but the city's pre-zoning for it is development, and so that would be an area that we would understand to be an area that was planned for development. And on the flanks of Lathrop, outside of the boundaries of the River Islands levee system, there's a small area that would be within the footprint of the proposed Lower San Joaquin River floodplain bypass area, and the city's general plan proposes that for open space use, and we've revised the map to show that as well. Finally, there are two small areas within the city of Rio Vista that the city's general plan proposes for continued agricultural use, and the maps have been revised to show that. Those revisions are shown in Figure 5.1, which is the basic map in Chapter 5 that depicts the land uses in the Delta. It also gets picked up in Figure 1.1, which summarizes the various outcomes of the Delta Plan in terms of levees and restoration and land use and other activities. And then it also gets continued in the maps of Appendix K, where we've provided what I hope are helpful maps in each of those municipalities to show in a greater detail how these land use designations that the cities have adopted for their spheres of influence work out. And those are the primary changes that the errata sheet summarizes.
Let's get council questions first. Mr. Natoli?
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. And again, I thank you and Jessica and Cindy for the briefing yesterday. I had some more time last night to think about a kind of concern I pointed out as we concluded yesterday, and that relates to how Freeport is being characterized. Understanding that it falls within the city of Sacramento's sphere of influence, I understand the connection there, and I went back and read the language and so forth. But what it seems to do by taking the exhibit of Freeport out of K1 and some of the conversation about spheres and where development would be anticipated and so forth, you lose, I think, in that context, the distinction that Freeport's an unincorporated town. It's not under the jurisdiction of the city of Sacramento, in the sphere or not. Does not have public water nor sewer. In fact, folks made a conscious choice a few years ago when presented that matter and voted not to annex to the city of Sacramento, albeit the city of Sacramento provides fire service to that area. It's a unorganized fire area. It seems to me, though, it gets lost because in the exhibit, it basically gets tagged onto an exhibit in the sphere for the city. And I think you certainly duly noted where green space is contemplated in the city sphere, but it's still an unincorporated town, and it's one of the historic communities along the river. And I think it's, again, I don't know about other communities of Byron or Knights and how they might be influenced, but as you kind of taken Mountain House and Byron and Knightson and Freeport and kind of lumped them together in some of the revised language, I believe that Freeport needs to be called out for what it is, an unincorporated town. It may be within the city sphere, and it may be unique in that sense. And so I know, again, consistent with the way you've tried to characterize this and portray it, and yet it's not the city doesn't make planning and land use decisions for the town of Freeport. That's still in the realm of the unincorporated county of Sacramento. And yet I don't want to lose some of the perspective that that's I raised this at the last council meeting about your characterization of disadvantaged communities relative to need for services and so forth, and that I felt that Freeport, from the standpoint of public utilities, falls into that category as well. And so I don't know how between now and when we next come back on this, but because it no longer has an exhibit of its own, it doesn't get called out separately. It gets mentioned in the communities and on page 196, and you pointed that out. And so it seems like it's gotten relegated to a kind of a category of its own under the umbrella of the city of Sacramento sphere of influence. And I don't know if that's a proper characterization. It has an identity of its own. It's an unincorporated town, and it's a historic community, legacy community. I guess I would, that's a kind of a loosely used term now. So, again, without getting into too much detail there, I think some further refinement on that, and maybe a way to make sure that gets accurately portrayed, because this document is going to be one that a lot of folks are going to look to, and Freeport doesn't disappear, but it gets, it gets kind of blurred, I think, relative to its actual status, recognizing that it does fit under the sphere, and so I don't disagree with that.
Maybe one approach would be to take figure K9, which is now titled, we could revise that so that it's at a greater detail, more focused on the community of Freeport, and we could revise the title of that figure so it was called Freeport and the City of Sacramento Sphere of Influence. We haven't had much engagement with Sacramento on this. It's not a plan that affects their land use actions very much.
I'm personally open on what Don suggested. I suspect that what will happen as these maps are refined is that over the next over a comment period, you will find all kinds of people who will come in wishing to have the maps varied or changed to either favor whatever their position is on some parcel of land at the edges of territories. And I'm open to consideration. This is your best judgment based on the information. I think it was very important to get the city sphere of influence information on the maps, which is the basic change. Don's point relates to a larger question, which is how do you deal with an anomalous situation where sphere of influence of a city surrounds a community that is not itself within the sphere of influence, but heavily affected by the decisions that that the city may make in the future?
Well, I believe Freeport is entirely within the city of Sacramento sphere of influence.
I'm not saying that it's not, but it's not controlled by the city of Sacramento. The city of Sacramento does not make the planning decisions for that community. And again, those folks have spoken, albeit they were split pretty evenly on it, but they remain in the unincorporated area, and we've worked on water and sewer issues as well. And so I think Phil makes a good point. I mean, again, I think the sphere, again, I wasn't saying that your representation was incorrect, because it is, but it's how then Freeport gets portrayed in that scenario, because I think it's distinguished from maybe any other community that you would find. And again, I don't know some of the other ones that you kind of put in those categories of spheres that either primary or secondary zone, but I think it loses some of the it kind of gets blended, I guess, in with a sphere when, again, it's a standalone community that it's small and it is in the sphere. But I don't see any time in the near future or even foreseeable future that's going to go into the city of Sacramento. And that conversation has occurred, and there's been a vote of the people in the last 10 years on that. So anyway, again, I don't want to bog down too much detail, but I think there may be a different, some exhibit that would, and I think the language then reflects that. And again, I mean, it's unique to that particular community, I believe. But there may be others that treat it similarly, but. Because when you have spheres, most other spheres don't take in some other community. Yeah. Is there another one in here that actually has the...
Not that I can recall off the top of my head. I don't think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. All right, Pat, on this on the Freeport.
Oh no.
Let's see if there are questions on Freeport. Randy.
Well, I have a question for Don.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to me that this is an issue that would affect the EIR process or the OAL process.
No.
So issues like this that would require a revision of a particular page or map Could we agree that this is an issue, and after the EIR process is complete, and the anticipated update after that process, incorporate things like that then?
You mean the update before final adoption? You mean?
Yeah.
No, I'm fine with that. And actually, what happened out of our last direction, they've gone back and refined and worked on definition of communities, and so the exhibit that was in our last draft came out. Again, I understand why, and I guess if it doesn't affect the circulation of document, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, again, but I think it. Again, what I'm trying to explain here this morning is that it needs to be, given, the standing that it has, and it's not from the standpoint of land use variation. It's just that I think it gets too blurred under the, under the scenario that we bring today. But I'm fine with that, Randy. To your point,
I do want to point out that it's important to finalize these maps as much as we can before we start the OAL process. So what I will suggest is that we actually, if we're going to make some changes that clarify things, that the council direct staff to work with Mr. Natoli to resolve that final issue before we begin circulation.
Yeah. Okay. Pat.
Dan, the minor changes you referred to that affect the maps of Lathrop and Stockton, did you refer to figure 5.1 in that?
That figure 5.1 is the summary
Right.
figure, and then you should have, I hope, additional, more detailed maps that were distributed earlier in the week. And the ones that depict the changes in Stockton is figure K10.
So these are, yeah, I see. So these are
These are the large fold-out maps,
Right.
are the ones that were extracted from the body of the Delta Plan. And it's my understanding, it is your intention that these maps will be in the body of the Delta Plan, but for purposes of discussion, you wanted them matched up with the more detailed charts in the 6 areas where there were some modifications.
Yeah,
and
they would be
adjustments.
in Appendix K, also with the unincorporated communities, but they were intended to provide more detailed depictions of the land use plans at a scale that makes it easier to understand what properties are planned for what uses.
the one in Stockton you described as the city doing pre-planning, or
Yeah, it's within their sphere of influence, and if you look at the map, you'll see the area. If you're looking at figure K10,
right.
and you can see the area at the north end of the property that's planned for development that's within the city of Lodi, and that's Lodi's wastewater treatment facilities. And then immediately south of that, there's a property that's not within the boundaries of the city of Stockton, but is in its sphere of influence, and that in its adopted general plan, Stockton had planned for development. And we had in that area in the San Joaquin County plan still is planned for agriculture. They hadn't updated their general plan yet. That's a process that's underway now. So our understanding of the general direction you were providing was that in city spheres of influence, the areas that were planned for development, within the sphere of influence, ought to be, shown as suitable.
And the test of planning is what?
That there's an adopted general plan that the municipality is prepared for the sphere of influence. Not every city plan has got land use recommendations for their sphere of influence. So in Tracy, for example, I believe that or in maybe it's Manteca, one of the communities down there, they're not making land use recommendations for their spheres of influence. But in this case, Stockton had. That's part of what the LAFCO would normally be looking at as they considered a city's request for a sphere of influence. Is what land uses do they intend there?
And in the case of Lathrop, you said there was an open space. Is that
you can look
green area that's?
Yeah, it's that small area that's on the southwest flank of Lathrop, and those are areas that are outside of the levied boundaries of the River Islands development, and they'll be within the area that has been considered a potential footprint for that flood bypass. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions on these maps? All right. Dan, are there other parts of the errata thing you want to discuss in any detail?
I think those are the key points. Otherwise, I think we're primarily trying to make you aware of some of the other notable typographic errors or graphic revisions that we thought warranted mention.
Okay, consistent with the conversation that Supervisor Natoli and Mr. Fiorini were having on how to treat the Freeport map, I think it's probably a good idea for us to all understand that with regard to these maps and the changes that you're suggesting, that there may well be other additional modifications, adjustments, or explanations that you'll discover in the next period of time. And so you'll be coming back to us with any change you deem worthy of modification, right?
Yeah, I fully anticipate that every local government is going to look at these with a magnifying glass and make sure that we're doing what their general plans call for. And I hope we've done that. We've done our best. We've met with most of the local governments that are affected. A few we've yet to hear from in terms of our request to meet with them, but I think we've tried really hard to make sure we got what their plans call for.
Okay. Don?
Yeah, just kind of reflecting on conversation a moment ago, one thing I guess I'd like us to consider would be to maybe have an exhibit, put K1 back in, and and you may have to have some language to tie to make sure it's clear that whatever the exhibit is for Sacramento, but to have an exhibit that shows Freeport as an unincorporated area town. That might be the simplest way, and make sure the language reflects whatever distinction that needs to be brought, because that is in the sphere, and there's this kind of dual connection to the information you're using. So, again, it may not have to be maybe a revision to the map, although it still then falls on the city of Sacramento's map versus as an unincorporated area town.
Okay.
What are we doing about the trees that were cut down in Freeport?
We're going to try to get some of those victory trees put back in there. So.
Oh, good.
Okay, all right.
We're working with Councilmember Fong.
Unless members want to know about the issue of the Freeport trees,
Victory trees.
We will pass beyond that, but it was an intense battle, still is, in the community.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
And speaking of which, the leader of the effort, now deceased, used to operate out of this room. Jerry McFetrich, a friend of many of us, lived down there and kind of led the battle on trees and has passed on, but his fight remains behind.
And his daughter actually is participating now. So
Okay.
Yeah, which is
Good. Okay. All right. Any other questions on the errata sheet? Then I think probably the way to proceed is ask council members if they have questions on the plan itself. We've gone through the errata sheet. We've looked, we've covered a lot of the stuff that was in your cover memo. So members, if you have questions on the plan itself, the appendices or so on, not previously discussed, you should raise them now. Ms. Gray?
No, I'm just going to say I'd like to reserve my comments after I hear from the public.
Oh, okay, sure.
Okay.